Now let's learn how to draw punnett squares. And of course we need a quick review before we can do that. Please remember that the genotype is the alleles that an organism has. It's the genes of the organism, and you use a letter to represent that genotype. Dominant alleles are represented with a capital letter, and recessive alleles are shown by writing a lowercase letter. You can have two types of genotypes. A heterozygous genotype is one that uses two different case letters, one big and one little. A homozygous genotype is one that uses two of the same case letters. This can be either two capitals or two lower cases. And a phenotype is describing the actual physical appearance of the organism. It's describing what the organism actually looks like on the outside. For example, brown fur or white fur. Let's go over this practice problem with the hamsters again. Predict the fur color of the offspring of a brown heterozygous hamster and a white homozygous hamster. Brown is dominant and white is recessive. Use the letter F for fur color. At this point, I highly recommend that you get a piece of paper and a pencil, and that you practice doing these problems with paper and pencil before you get your assignment. When you get your assignment, it'll be a lot easier if you've practiced and you understand the concepts. We've done this problem before. See if you can repeat the process without any help. Okay, now that you've tried to do this on your own, let's see if you were right. First, draw your 4 boxes. Then, separate parent 1's alleles on the top. In this case, we're looking at the brown hamster. It doesn't really matter which parent you put on the top and which parent you put on the side. But one of the parents was capital F, lowercase f. Notice that you only write one letter above each box. Then separate parent 2's alleles on the other side. Parent 2 was the white hamster, lowercase f, lowercase f. Then remember, drop the top and slide the side. That means take the letter from the top and drop it down, write it in the 2 boxes below it. Then do the same thing on the side, but slide it over so that you're writing the same letter on both boxes beside it. When you do that, you should come up with 2 boxes that have capital F, lowercase f. Remember, that means it's heterozygous. And you should have 2 boxes with lowercase f, lowercase f. That means it's homozygous recessive. Now let's look at the phenotypes of these hamsters. In this box we have a capital letter. That means these hamsters must receive or must show the dominant phenotype. That means these hamsters must be brown. In these 2 boxes, there are no capital letters, so they are showing the recessive phenotype, which in this case is white. Let's review the steps for drawing punnett squares one more time. First, draw a square with 4 boxes. On the assignment that you download from me, you will see, you'll see squares with 9 boxes, and the corner box will be shaded out. That's because it's a lot easier for you to type if you have boxes to type in. So, in addition to the 4 offspring boxes, I also gave you boxes to put the parent alleles in on the top and on the side. So the next step after you've drawn your square is to separate parent 1's alleles along the top boxes. Then do the same thing with parent 2's alleles along the side. Write the parent allele from the top in the offspring box below it, and write the parent allele from the side in the offspring box beside it. As I say, drop the top, slide the side. And then repeat that for each offspring box. Let's look at another problem with Mendel's pea plants. In this case, it appears that we are crossing 2 tall plants. First, we draw our punnett square. Then, this parent is a tall parent, which means in this case it has a homozygous genotype of capital letter, capital letter. We're using the letter D to represent plant height. This parent is also tall, but its genotype is heterozygous, one big D and one little d. If we drop the top and slide the side, we find that in our first box we should get big D, big D. In our second box, drop the top, slide the side. We also get big D, big D. In our third box, if we drop the top and slide the side, we should get big D, little d. And the same with our fourth box. Now to figure out what these plants will look like when they actually grow. Anytime you see a capital letter, that means it will have the dominant phenotype. In this case, tall is dominant to short. So there's a 100% chance that all offspring plants from this cross will be tall. None of the offspring could have two recessive alleles, so none of the offspring would grow to be short plants. Before we go on to some more practice problems, let's talk about ratios and probability. This is where the math part comes in. A ratio compares two quantities. These here refer to other assignments. They don't go with number 5 and number 6 necessarily on your assignment. A probability predicts the chance that something will happen. So you'd say, like, it's a 65% chance of rain today. That's a probability. For example, the probability of throwing heads on a coin is 1 in 2. 1 out of 2 is the ratio. When you reduce that as a fraction and then multiply by 100, that turns into a percentage of 50%. Your predictions become more accurate the more trials you run. This means when Mendel was doing his experiments, he repeated the same experiment time and time and time and time again until he understood that the probability turns out to be very, very close to what actually happens. From this point on, we're also going to figure out the probabilities for each Punnett square we do. A percentage is a ratio that compares a number to 100. For example, the ratio 3 out of 4 can be written as a fraction. And to convert that to a percentage, you do 3 divided by 4, which gives you the decimal 0.75, which is 75%. An easy way to think of this is to think of, especially when related to genetics, is to think of quarters. Like, how many quarters make up a dollar? 4. If you have 3 quarters, you have 75 cents, which is the same as 75%. If you had 2 quarters, that would be 50 cents, or 50%. Alright, let's try some more practice problems, with probabilities this time. Predict the offspring of 2 white homozygous cows. Black is dominant over white, and use the letter B. So, black is dominant over white is a big clue as to what the genotypes of these two parents are. If those two parents are white, that means that they can't have any dominant alleles. All the alleles they have must be recessive. So both parents are little b, little b. Then it should be easy to see that if you drop the top and slide the side, all offspring will also be little b, little b. If black is dominant to white, in this case, all offspring should be white. Now if we look at the genotype ratio. To do that, we look at the different types of genotypes that we have in the offspring boxes. In this case, they're all the same. So we say the genotype ratio for little b is 4 out of 4. That's equal to 100%. Then we do the same thing with phenotypes. Count up how many different phenotypes we have. In this case, the only phenotype we see is white, so that is also 4 out of 4, or 100%. Here's our next practice problem. Remember, I highly encourage you to do this on paper with pencil before you fill in your answers on your assignment. Predict the offspring of 2 gray heterozygous rats. Gray is dominant over white, which is recessive, and use the letter G. Both parents are gray. Since that's the dominant trait, we also have to know that their genotypes are heterozygous in order to continue. Remember, heterozygous means 2 different case letters. If you draw your Punnett square, you have two parents. The parents are the same as each other. They're both heterozygous, which means they're both big G, little g. Then, if you drop the top and slide the side, in this box we should have big G, big G. Next should be big G, little g. Our third box, drop the top, slide the side, should be little g, little g. And our fourth box is big G, little g. Now let's figure out the phenotypes. Gray is the dominant color. White is the recessive color. Anytime we see a capital letter, whether we have one or two of them, those turn out to be gray. Anytime we have two lowercase letters, that turns out to be white. So now let's look at our phenotype and genotype ratios. The genotype ratio looks at, we have three different genotypes here. Big G, big G. There's 1 out of the 4 boxes. So that gives us a ratio of 1 out of 4, or 25%. We also have big G, little g. 2 out of the 4 boxes are big G, little g. And we also have 1 little g, little g. So you can see whenever you add these up, 1 plus 2 plus 1, we still get a total of 4, because we still have 4 boxes to work with. This would be 25%, 50%, and 25%. If you add your percentages, you should always come out to 100. Now let's look at the phenotypes. We have 3 out of 4 boxes showing a gray phenotype. That's 75%. 1 out of the 4 boxes is showing a white phenotype. That's 25%. Remember, 75 plus 25 equals 100. That's an easy way to check to see if you've done it correctly. Let's move on to practice problem number 4. This says predict the pea shape of the offspring of one heterozygous round pea plant and one homozygous wrinkled pea plant. Round is dominant over wrinkled, and use the letter R. First, draw your boxes. The first parent, heterozygous round, must have 1 capital and 1 lowercase letter. The second parent, homozygous wrinkled, must have 2 lowercase letters because it's showing the recessive trait. If we drop the top and slide the side, this is the possible offspring. Now to determine our phenotypes. Big R, little r, would that be round or wrinkled? If you guessed round, you're correct. Little r would be wrinkled. The genotype ratios we see in these offspring are big R, little r, 2 out of 4, or 50%. Little r, 2 out of 4, or 50%. And we get the same thing for the phenotypes, but instead of writing R's, we write round and wrinkled. Hopefully by this point you're getting the idea. Now let's think about this. What are the chances of 2 humans having a boy versus a girl? How could you solve this? If you think back to one of the things we discussed when we were talking about genes and chromosomes, you might remember that it is a chromosome that determines the gender of a child. XY would be a male. XX would be the female. So if we combine these chromosomes in a Punnett square, we see that this is the dad, the father. He has one X and one Y chromosome to pass on to his offspring. The mother can only pass on an X. When we see how those combine, we see looks like there's a 50-50 chance for parents to have a girl versus a boy. Just a quick review. What do we call the different forms a gene may have for each trait? How do you write a homozygous genotype? How do you write a heterozygous genotype? Remember that genotypes use capital and lowercase letters to represent the genes that an organism has. And finally, which kind of trait cannot be passed from parent to child? A, eye color, B, height, or C, a broken arm. If you have any questions about drawing Punnett squares, please make sure you send me a message so that you are in good shape for our next assignment.